Well, this has certainly been a long time coming, but considering that this is the 20th anniversary of the end of this trilogy, I think there's no better time than to finally travel to Middle-earth. Hey everyone, it's Alexander Robinson. Welcome to my channel and welcome to my review of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. And obviously we're going to kick off with the first movie, Fellowship of the Ring, which came out in 2001. I know it might seem utterly pointless to talk about the plot to this movie and the entire trilogy itself, but I know there's got to be some people out there probably that have never read or watched Lord of the Rings. So for those few people out there, this is based off the J.R.R. Tolkien stories that basically redefined what we think of when we think of high fantasy. And this first film, Fellowship of the Ring, basically involves the One Ring of Power, which was forged by the Dark Lord Sauron, but after his defeat, the ring went missing because it wasn't destroyed. So it's soon discovered that the ring is in Hobbiton, a peaceful little town full of hobbits that want nothing to do with any conflict. Obviously, there's a whole other book slash trilogy of films that explains how the ring got into Hobbiton, but I won't go into details in that. But in terms of this story in particular, the hobbit Frodo Baggins is tasked with being the ring bearer as he travels to Mount Doom with three other hobbits, a wizard, a dwarf, an elf, and two men, also known as the Fellowship of the Ring, because Sauron's forces are starting to grow, and with a potential rise to power again, they must destroy the One Ring in order to destroy Sauron. Clearly, I am a nerd. I have no shame in admitting that, and I've covered so many different types of geek properties on this channel. Obviously, my big forte is Godzilla, but also Star Wars, Marvel, DC, Harry Potter, just so many big geekdoms out there. But Lord of the Rings was one that went mostly absent on this channel. I did review the Hobbit trilogy, which I would like to take another look at some point in the future, and I mentioned that the trilogy itself, Lord of the Rings, is among my top 100 favorite movies of all time, but I've never actually reviewed the films themselves. So I figured with this year being the 20th anniversary of Return of the King, there's no better time than to review the Lord of the Rings trilogy at long last. My introduction to this trilogy was actually very different compared to what I imagine a lot of people's introduction was, because I didn't see the Lord of the Rings films in theaters. I missed that boat entirely, and I didn't watch them until about 10 years after they came out, when I got the DVDs for Christmas. I watched the theatrical editions first, obviously, and it was throughout, I think, a month where me and my mom watched these films, and I just fell in love with them. And I always felt like this first film, Fellowship of the Ring, was always my favorite because it was the start of this journey. There's so many brilliant things in it that I absolutely love. It just felt a little more iconic and tighter than I feel like Two Towers and Return of the King are, but I'll talk about those movies in the next couple of weeks. Another reason why I missed the Lord of the Rings films in theaters was because a month prior to Fellowship of the Ring coming out, we saw the release of Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. And I had read the first two Harry Potter books beforehand, so I was obviously more excited to see this and didn't have a clue in the world about what Lord of the Rings was. But I will admit that the first time I watched Fellowship of the Ring, I ended up liking it so much more than Sorcerer's Stone, which is still a good movie. But here's what I love about Fellowship of the Ring in terms of its world building. We're not really introduced to Middle-earth through a bunch of exposition. Harry Potter got away with a lot of world building through exposition because our main character was pretty much an outsider, much like the audience. So as the characters were explaining the wizarding world to Harry, we're getting an introduction to that world as well. But with Fellowship of the Ring, the only background we ever get is to the war, the stakes, and what the story is going to be about. In terms of the actual world itself, we don't really get spoon-fed world building. We discover these unique locations and these amazing worlds as we're traveling along with the Fellowship. And none of the characters have to explain certain scenarios or why certain things work. It's told through us visually, and we feel like we're living in this world just as much as the characters are. And speaking of those characters, they're all absolutely iconic, and every single casting choice is just perfect. Elijah Wood is fantastic as Frodo Baggins, and I really love his character because they firmly establish that hobbits are just peaceful creatures. They want nothing to do with any conflicts. They just want to hang out, smoke weed, and that's pretty much it. So they're pretty much UC Santa Cruz in a way. Quick sidebar for a second. I make that joke, but in reality, a lot of us at UC Santa Cruz, at least the people that I went there with, really did paint that school as Middle Earth. And there were certain areas on campus that people really said, yeah, if there's anywhere that's Hobbiton, it's this one part, which I'm not going to go into because that's too much of an inside joke. Back to the movie itself. With Frodo, even though he's very timid of all the stuff that he encounters along the way, he really is willing to go on this journey and see it through. He might be scared first, but that doesn't stop him. And the one scene that really proves this point is probably my favorite scene in the whole movie, where you have a council of elves, dwarves, and man arguing about what to do with the ring, or who's going to take it to Mount Doom. Because as Sean Bean puts it, one does not simply walk through the gates of Mordor. And it's just this huge argument where Frodo is sitting to the side, not saying anything, and he just stands up and says, "I'll do it." And in that point, everyone just kind of unites around him. Aragorn says he'll lay down his life for Frodo. Legolas tells Frodo that you have my bow, and Gimli tells Frodo that he has his axe. And it's just a really great moment that hits me more than many of the action scenes in this movie. One of my other favorite characters in this movie, and who might be my favorite character throughout the entire Middle-earth saga, Lord of the Rings and Hobbit, is Sir Ian McKellen as Gandalf. And specifically in this movie, he's Gandalf the Grey, and probably the most iconic look when you think of a wizard. You think of somebody with a long beard, pointed hat with that around, I don't know exactly what it's called, and a staff. Like, Gandalf is such a fantastic character, and Ian McKellen does a wonderful job. He actually got an Oscar nomination for Best Supporting Actor, and his performance really is that good. He acts sort of as a guiding force for Frodo, but he's also very involved with the action scenes, because he's got a sword hanging around in his cloak. And honestly, in terms of this character, I like Gandalf when he's known as Gandalf the Grey more than Gandalf the White. But again, 2 more movies, I'll talk about him a little later. Another character I love is Aragorn, played by Viggo Mortensen, who really puts his all into this role. Like, he is fully dedicated to this character, and I love how he's a man who is destined to be king, but he doesn't want that responsibility. He basically plays out more like a ranger, and he doesn't want the responsibility of being king. Obviously, there's a lot more to talk about with this character, but I'll have to wait till the next couple of movies, considering that the last one is called Return of the King. Orlando Bloom is great as Legolas, John Rhys-Davies is great as Gimli, Liv Tyler is really good as Arwen, and normally I'm not a huge fan of Liv Tyler. I just think that she's a beautiful woman, but acting-wise, I always found her to be flat in most movies that I've seen her in. But in this movie, she has a lot of subtlety to her role, even though she's not really in this movie all that much. Cate Blanchett's really good, Ian Holm as the older Bilbo Baggins is fantastic, and Sean Astin as Samwise is really good as well, and a character that I'll be talking about a little more because there's more to Sam and Frodo's relationship that can be said in the later movies. Christopher Lee always makes for a fantastic villain, but you do have to wonder when Gandalf approaches Saruman for help, why weren't you suspicious about this weird tower that he was living in? Because that's clearly the fortress of a villain. But whatever. There's so many goofy moments throughout the Lord of the Rings trilogy that I could seriously make fun of. Like some awkward close-up shots, some weird over-the-top acting choices, but that is a testament to how good this movie is, that the goofy stuff you just don't even think about. The look of this movie is also just insane. There's so many great sweeping shots of locations that they actually went to. The costumes, the props, the makeup effects on all these creatures is just spectacular, and the special effects are just as good as they were back in 2001. Obviously, there's a lot of CGI effects throughout, like some of the landscaping, the Balrog, but what has always been the most impressive effect for me is the size comparison between the hobbits and the rest of the beings in Middle-earth. Just the fact that I don't ever see any of the seams, and I just always assume that Elijah Wood and Sean Astin are really that small. Like, if I were to ever meet Elijah Wood in person, he'd probably be right here, so I just can't get that out of my head because it looks so good. It's also worth noting that this movie cost $93 million to make, and it looks better than other movies that came out. For example, The Mummy Returns cost $98 million, $5 million more than Fellowship, and a lot of the CG effects, especially the Scorpion King, look like ass. Jurassic Park 3 had the exact same budget as Fellowship of the Ring, but was an hour and a half less and had not as impressive visual effects. And then Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone cost $120 million, and is about 30 minutes shorter, but VFX-wise doesn't even look as good as the effects in Fellowship of the Ring. So this one, 22 years later, is still as amazing as ever. And then of course I have to talk about the Oscar-winning score by Howard Shore. It's just brilliant. So many iconic themes, very bombastic, very whimsical when it needs to be. Like the theme for the Hobbits is memorable. The Bridge of Khazad-dûm, I hope I pronounced that right, is fantastic. Like that, I think a lot of people will be with me on this. That is the Lord of the Rings theme. You hear that and you instantly know that's Lord of the Rings. The action scenes are also a blast, although if I had any criticisms, I think in this first movie, the editing is a little sloppy on some of those sequences. Like, there are too many close-up shots to where it's utter chaos and I can't tell what's going on. But most of the time, it's well framed and exciting. And normally I would talk about how long this movie is. Like, guys, did it really need to be nearly 3 hours, or nearly 4 hours if you're talking about the extended version? But that never really crossed my mind when watching this movie. Even with taking a couple days to watch the extended version, I never really got the feeling that it was too long, because I was paced perfectly. I felt so immersed in this world that I didn't want to leave. For me, it's one of the very few times where a movie warrants being this long, because I've seen so many movies throughout my time here on YouTube where I'm like, there was no reason at all for this movie to be as long as it is. And there are so few movies out there that can actually get away with being 3+ hours long. And Fellowship of the Ring is certainly one of those movies. Like, it is just so good, so well done, so memorable. It's just cinematic perfection all around. So obviously I have to say, get off your ass and go see it right now, but I imagine most of you have already seen it. So if you have, just watch it again. And there you go, that's my review for The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring. Now I have to make a full disclosure before I continue. I am watching the extended versions for this series of reviews, but I'm not going to be making comparisons to the theatrical cuts and the extended versions, because I'm not as familiar with Lord of the Rings and the differences between either versions as I am with, say, Peter Jackson's King Kong, or Avatar, or T2 and Aliens. So apologies for not making any comparisons. And with that said, next week we'll be tackling the second film in this trilogy, The Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers, which I have actually seen the extended edition of this movie years before getting around to this series of reviews. So I can't wait to talk about that movie next week. But until then, I want to know what you guys think about Fellowship of the Ring. If you've seen it, what did you think? Whatever the case may be, let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell button to get notifications. You can also follow me on Facebook, Instagram, Letterboxd, Threads. I'll see you guys in the next video, but until then, have a good day and take care of yourselves.